Hi and welcome to the Recruitment and Beyond podcast. My name's Ewan Anderson. I'm the Marketing Director here at Eden Scott. This is your essential guide to navigating the ever-changing world of human resources and recruitment. We chat with industry-leading figures to give you the inside track on growing and developing the very best teams. Today we chatted to Fiona Hogg, Chief People Officer at NHS Scotland, about what it takes to set up people function at an organisation as large and as complex as the NHS. Hi, welcome back to the Recruitment and Beyond podcast. We are joined today by Fiona Hogg, who is the Chief People Officer at NHS Scotland. Fiona, great to have you with us.
Thanks, Ewan. Lovely to be here.
So, Fiona, what does the Chief People Officer at NHS Scotland do? You want to give us a bit of insight into your role there at NHS Scotland?
Yes, of course. And I say it's an interesting role because NHS Scotland is almost a sort of umbrella term for our 22 different health boards and employers that make up the NHS in Scotland. So each of those has their own leadership structure, their own people directors, and my role is really as the professional lead for the people function across NHS Scotland and working between government and the health boards as employers to move forward the people agenda and support them as best I can.
Okay, so there's that's a huge task on your hands there. So when you're thinking about the kind of core principles of what you do and your thoughts in terms of HR, because obviously you've worked not just with NHS Scotland, but with other large organisations as well. What are when you're building and developing an HR function, what are the kind of core principles that you like to work towards?
Yeah, and it probably sounds a bit trite, but it's really important, I think, to really put people at the heart of that. And I think even across our 22 organisations in NHS Scotland, each has got a very different culture. It does very different things. We've got small boards like NHS Orkney that employ, sort of a few hundred people and support a very small population, whereas we've got Greater Glasgow and Clyde with over 40,000 employees. Yeah. And then we've got supporting boards in between. And I think that's a bit like organisations in our wider system. And I think really understanding both the people team that you've got and the services they provide and the capability that they have is really key, but also what does your organisation and the people that you support expect from you, and making sure that then you can come up with a way of supporting that organisation, that you've got the people and the capability to support. And that's what the organisation wants and needs and understands. And it can be easy for people to say, a new people director's coming in, we want you to reshape the people function, that'll sort everything out, when you come. And actually, the worst thing you can do on your first month or two in a new job is to do anything about changing structures or roles. You really need to understand what you've got, what people want, what you need, and actually take the time to sort of come up with something. But even then, when you come up with what that looks like, you have to work really hard to make sure that the people team get it, can do it, support it, can influence it, and then that the organisation, it's going to deliver what they need. They understand how to access the support they need in the services. Because if you don't do that, you could have the best theoretical model in the world, but actually if your team don't want to work in it, or if the people aren't getting what they need very quickly, you're going to have to start unpicking. So I think we learn through our errors and challenges in that respect, I think.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was going to say, because it's so complex that, how do you, from an organisational structure point of view, like if you're pulling that together, how do you look at the different requirements for each area and pull together almost like key functions for that? And, how do you effectively deliver that, the services and support that each area needs? Because there's got to be some kind of commonality, presumably. There's some areas that, there's just key roles that are required. But then, like you say, there's Scotland such a, it's so disparate, so many, different approaches in different areas. Orkney's different to Glasgow's, different to the Highlands, different to Edinburgh and the borders and whatever it might be. How do you pull together an organisational structure for that?
Yeah, and it is a challenge, and I think there, sort of the NHS has been, in existence for a long time, and there are elements of that have historically been quite traditional. So typically within the NHS, there's always been a split between what they call HR and then the organisational development side of things. And so you've tended to have a lot of people who do the very sort of process and policy orientated stuff, and then people that do more of the development interventions and stuff. And actually, I think part of where we need to move to, and are moving to gradually over time, is that actually those splits become, for me, it's why I talk about the people profession, because actually language is really important, because there are connotations around how people use HR, OD, personnel, all these different things. And actually it's about us trying to sort of set that this is ultimately about people, and it's about culture in the organisation. And actually it doesn't necessarily matter if your job is about employee relations or supporting policies. Actually, in the future, we'll all need to have those skills in our tool set that allow people, to allow us to have conversations with managers that sort of try to help them resolve the problem without going down a policy route. So I think that being able to be flexible about what resources you have and how they're organised is key, because, as you say, a 600 person organisation versus a 40,000 person organisation, you can't have lots of specialists in those smaller organisations. But in some ways that's quite good, because that can really give people opportunities to move around the people function and develop a range of skills that maybe in the past people have been quite siloed. If you start off in recruitment, you're probably going to get stuck in recruitment. Or if you're if you're an employee relations expert, well, you're not going to go over into OD. And for me, we really need to change that, because that makes really rewarding careers for people professionals as well.
Yeah. I mean, you've touched on this a wee bit actually about culture, and it's the same for big organisations, I presume, when you worked in the bank and so on, is knowing that if somebody walks into a bank in Edinburgh or a bank in wherever it might be in Aberdeen, and the same way they go into NHS Grampian, or they go into NHS Dumfries and Galloway, whatever it might be, that there's a similar sort of approach in terms of the people, in terms of the care, in terms of that the service they provide. Is that part of what you've tried to do in terms of, okay, there's different requirements in different areas, but as a culture and as an organisation, do you have that core principle and that core culture at the centre of it?
Yeah, and I think that is key, because, as you say, ultimately we must never forget in the NHS that our core purpose is there to serve our population and to support them, to at some of their worst times. And actually to the population, whilst within the NHS we're all very conscious that we might be employed by 22 different organisations, to everybody else we're just the NHS. And actually so it doesn't matter to us if it's Tayside or if it's Forth Valley or if it's Orkney or whatever. To us, to our population, it's the NHS. And so I think over time we have tried to bring some consistency. We have a workforce plan across and a workforce strategy across health and social care, and we have the NHS Scotland values which underpin a lot of what we do, and we are trying to do more. We have, for example, we've developed a range of employment policies over the last 4 years, rather than each board having their own one. And that is all about how can we try and both, I guess, harness the benefits of being of having of having so many employees and not everybody having to do things individually, but again to make that experience, I suppose, of our employees and our patients and communities as consistent as possible, so that actually, if something happens in one board, it shouldn't be fundamentally different how you're treated or how you're supported across that. But that's a big task to gradually move towards that, because we've everybody has been doing things for so long on their own that it's but our sort of need to reform is underpinned by actually the way we'll reform is by delivering services and therefore employment that is more consistent and more joined up across Scotland.
Getting that consistency across the service is so important, isn't it? And it comes from the people, because ultimately it's a people service, and pretty much every business is, let's face it. So getting that right and getting people to buy into that culture is so important. And Has technology helped? I mean, does technology play a role in terms of modernising that HR function now across the NHS? Is it a key part of what you're looking at as well?
It definitely it's definitely one of our biggest opportunities. We've been notoriously slow, I think, in as a lot of big organisations are, in terms of actually the effort that's required to try and develop systems and you know, kind of is huge. But also our context of the 22 individual employers has meant that historically, you know, people could opt out. So we would start off with something that was going to be for 22, and then maybe only 10 boards take it forward. And then you've got, you know, so we are, as part of our reform agenda, that is one of the key areas where on certain things we are going to have to be in a position where every board in Scotland, every employer, you know, sort of signs up to certain things, because they won't work unless we all do it. We've got recruitment is probably one of the areas where we do have a single platform that we use for recruitment across the NHS. That's been really it's been really good, and it's a really good enabling technology. But actually, part of the challenge we have with that is how do we join up behind the systems, because that would make you think, if you're a you know, sort of an applicant, that actually there's something really quite coherent sat behind the technology, that your application for that job in that area sort of goes in, and you know, you've registered an interest with NHS Scotland, but actually behind that technology we're still 22 entirely separate employers, and actually probably hundreds of different recruiting managers in that organisation. So I think there's definitely a focus on that, and for a lot of the transactional services we provide, it's critical we harness technology also in how people access information and are able to self-serve. But I think we're on a journey with that, but it's going to take time, and it's as much about changing how we work behind the technology and how we join up as the systems themselves.
I mean, technology is changing every industry, isn't it? You know, the introduction of artificial intelligence, as well as automation and other things, are really having an impact on all these areas, and they can help with efficiency and so on. But it's actually, you know, for you, that role across all those different boards is quite a challenge, especially if there's still a level of autonomy amongst them all. You know, you've got to have that, like you say, consistency and requirement for everybody to buy into it. And it may not always work for everybody, but I think getting that consistency really helps. Again, going back to that customer service, that you know, there's a patient coming in anywhere knows that there's going to be a consistency in terms of that delivery, and the staff know that as well. So it's key, isn't it? And this is slightly off the questions we were talking about, but does that include things like people analytics? Is that part of what you've got involved with in terms of technology in the NHS? Is that somewhere where you're going towards, just in terms of helping people develop and grow as individuals?
Yeah, and I think our ability to have good data from our people systems is key. It's probably one of our key barriers at the moment that mean that actually being able to understand, you know, in real detail our sort of workforce and some of the key measures that we'd like to have is definitely needs to be improved. We can access quite a lot of data, and that can give us indications about, you know, good things like turnover and you know, vacancy levels, and we have some information on things like people processes. Our things like our equality and diversity information can be quite difficult, and we really need to. But actually, I think part of the commissioning of the new systems that we're going to develop has to make sure that we do, you know, think about that and how we commission it, because we can't continue to rely on the fact that we don't have good data, you know, as a almost like an excuse why we can't measure things. That's not where we need to be. So I think it is key for us, and again, it's better for us to try and get to a point where we've got something that's standard across the whole of our 22 employers, rather than individual boards investing both the time and resources in custom systems, which they've sort of had to do in the past.
No, absolutely. Having that data will be so valuable to help people develop and grow, and help the service grow as well. So and in terms of, I suppose, going on from that, in terms of attracting and retaining talent, obviously it's a real challenge out there to bring in the right people at the right time. And is there a lot of work going into the back of that in terms of your vision and your values to really sell what it is to the NHS? Because I think it's very much a vocation, isn't it? It's very much coming to work for the NHS. A lot of what we do now talks a lot about companies needing to have that purpose. That purpose and their vision and value should be up front and centre, and that's what sells the job to people. Is that what you're working on in terms of trying to attract and retain the very best talent for the NHS?
Yeah, I think that is really it's really important for us. I mean, it's the reason that I joined the NHS in 2019 when I came to NHS Highland, having primarily worked in the private sector. I was looking for a role that would challenge me and but also give me some purpose and some sense of working for an organisation where I could feel I was genuinely contributing and making a difference and supported the values of the organisation. And I think, again, this is one of the areas where we have a number of, our employers are leading on their recruitment on an individual basis, and there is some great practice going on out there. We've also done some things where we've joined up collectively. International recruitment over the last few years has been one of those things, and we've really been able to come together. But actually, a key part of what we need to do moving forward is to collectively, use all the talents we've got across the system and really make more use of the brand of NHS Scotland and what how can we use that? We currently, things like nursing graduate recruitment, most boards individually will lead on that. If we had the resources and the actually being able to do NHS Scotland recruitment, the individual employers make their own decisions, but actually we bring that together. That would make it much more effective for us, but more importantly for candidates to sort of apply once and to work through that. Our young workforce is another key priority for us. And again, some boards are doing amazing things in terms of engaging with young people and with wider sort of people who struggle to access employment in the community. But again, collectively, across the whole of NHS Scotland, using our kind of collective brand and resources to try and get a better profile for the kind of careers and particularly the careers that aren't about the ones that people think about. So we're very well set up with nurses and doctors and the traditional roles, but actually we don't have programs where people who might, in school, where young people could say, oh, I'd quite be interested in working in the NHS. What kind of jobs do you have? How do I get into finance in the NHS, or into people, or into support functions, or into caring? So I think there's a huge amount we can and need to be doing, because we have an ageing workforce, and we also have a not just a responsibility to ensure we provide employment to our local communities, but actually from a sustainability perspective, the more that we can recruit and train people to do roles that they want to do within their local community, that helps us, because actually that's a workforce that are going to want to stay working for us to grow their careers, and that's particularly important for some of our more remote and rural communities as well, where actually that sustainable workforce needs us to do training and development and find qualification pathways that maybe don't involve people going off to university.
Yeah, that retention of a local workforce is so important, is it? Because it's people they know, they buy into that, they buy into the supporting their local community, and it's such a vital thing. And I think a lot of organisations have tried to get that, is to get that purpose. So you've got the skills, but you need that purpose. You need something else, and I think the NHS has that in abundance. I mean, obviously, the great work that you guys do is phenomenal, and I think it makes a massive difference to people when they're looking for that role. If they have a finance background, well, actually, there's real opportunities there to work for the NHS, and I get the added value of some added purpose as well, I suppose. So that NHS Scotland brand really comes with I suppose additional benefits as well, doesn't it? There's more than just the role. There's a whole experience where working for the NHS. Would that be right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's often easy to sort of listen to all the sort of media reports and politics about how dreadful things in the NHS are and how difficult and challenged it is. But actually, the reality is lots of people coming to work every day, determined to do a good job, and actually, relatively speaking, being well rewarded through, sort of good pay and particularly strong terms and conditions, things like pension and sort of sickness absence. And also, that the support that people have in terms of family-friendly policies, well-being, etc. But I think both for colleagues who don't currently work in the NHS, we're not very good at really drawing out that wider package. But also sometimes I think we're not, we need to do more in the retention space, and actually how do we make sure that people have a good experience and understand that actually the grass isn't always greener on the other side, and moving into sort of different sectors of employment, may offer different, financial rewards, but actually, some of those things that become more important, particularly as we get older, in terms of stability, in terms of, kind of support with pay if you are sick, and I say the family friendly policies are things that often people don't think about until they need them.
Yeah, absolutely. The retention part of it's really interesting. It kind of leads us on a wee bit in terms of employee well-being, but also retention around career development and progression. I think you touched on it slightly, but it's just highlighting that again, some of the research we've done is that people will move, for purpose. They will move in terms of the job because they feel there's a bigger purpose there in terms of the role that they're going to do. But secondly, about their own career progression. And I guess, is that something, again, that you're looked at across the NHS to ensure that people know they're coming in for a career for life? There's an opportunity to grow and develop with the NHS.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a key area for us, and over the last a couple of years, we've particularly been focusing on our sort of executive and aspiring chief executive sort of cohort across Scotland to try and make sure that we are supporting boards to identify people who are at that level and who may be ready to progress, and sort of both looking at particular development centres for them. We've developed a sort of leadership success profile that helps understand what skills and capabilities are needed, and a development centre that matches their progress against that. But it's not just about that formal development, because having identified people potentially who have the ability and the aspiration to progress, we can also help expose them to opportunities to participate in pieces of work or get involved in collaborations that give them something that they may not be able to get within their own board or within their own role. So that kind of most senior level piece has been key. But the other thing is that at a local level, everything tends to come back to how good a manager people have at a local level. Do they understand how to have good support and supervision conversations? Do they understand how to discuss people's development needs? Do they understand how to sort of help people resolve conflicts or concerns? And I think that's part of what we really need to make sure, because what we will often see is that if people don't understand at a local level that opportunities are available or that they can be supported because they're not having those conversations, they will probably go off and look for a job rather than being supported to sort of stay. And I think that mindset of that comes back to the whole NHS Scotland piece. Actually, it's not about losing people to different employers. It's actually about going collectively. How do we try and make sure that we share the talent across NHS Scotland and make it, support people to move? Because sometimes, and again, I go back to maybe some of our remote and rural boards, or our boards that do very specialist things like like the NHS Education for Scotland, that's all about training, or about NHS 24 that supports the 111 service. If people may ultimately want to go back into those boards and continue their careers, but they might not be able to get the fully rounded experience by staying in that board, even with their support. So actually, how we as NHS Scotland support people to move around to get the skills they need to then be able to take up some of those more senior and specialist roles sort of later on is a really important area.
Yeah, just going on from that, the leadership part of it is really vital, isn't it? Leaders are so important to organisations, and I think that makes a massive difference, that people really understand there's opportunities here for them to grow with NHS Scotland, not always necessarily within the same board, but there's real opportunities across the board, isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that whole theme of leadership and culture is it becomes more and more important. And obviously, you know, my own personal experience in joining the NHS, I joined NHS Highland at a time when we'd just had the Sturrock report into issues around poor culture and behaviours. And that was that you know, as a people professional, I learned so much from being part of that situation, but it really brought home to me that actually that of the importance at a very local level of how people experience work and is entirely driven by the people that they work next to and the person that manages them, and often the narrative around, you know, the NHS being broken, and you know, we talk about these huge big cultural and leadership and resource issues. But actually what you find on the ground is that if you've got someone who is a good manager, who supports their team, who encourages them, who listens to them and tries to resolve concerns, that is what people will work within those difficult situations because
Absolutely.
they're supported, you know, whereas you can be in exactly the same situation but without that good management support at a local level. And actually that's often where people tip over into that not being a good experience, not being heard, and not because anybody gets up in the morning thinking I don't want to be a good manager, but actually we haven't supported and invested in them, we haven't made it clear what we expect of them, and we haven't given them the tools to do that. So for me, that local, you know, kind of hands-on management is absolutely key to our colleagues' experience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I suppose just to touch on the insights that you talked about before, the HR insights and effectively managing and understanding, you know, where there's success and where there's requirements. What sort of things, what sort of HR strategies are you putting in place from an NHS Scotland point of view, just to truly understand the needs and requirements of going across all 22 boards?
Yeah, and so what we've tended to do is focus. We published our health and social care workforce strategy sort of in 2021, and you know, sort of obviously we've been living through the pandemic and financial crisis, but actually there's a few key things there that we've really focused on, and sort of leadership and culture has been a sort of key part of that. Sort of colleague wellbeing is another area where we've tried to sort of, you know, kind of work across the system to support boards in that space. Inclusion is another big area for us, and obviously as boards we have as a system, you know, we have a real we have very clear policies and standards and expectations in terms of being inclusive and promoting equality and diversity, but equally we know that actually our insights tell us that, you know, particularly our colleagues from minority ethnic backgrounds typically experience more challenges in recruitment, particularly in progression and promotion. There's a real we're not representative of our populations, especially at the more senior levels, and so we've had a real focus on how can we support that. We've set up a national forum. And all of our employers in this sort of financial year, all of our board executives have been charged with creating and delivering an anti-racism plan, and that's a bit of a unique thing because it's twofold. What we've done is we've joined up the employment experience and inclusion aspect, but also as providers of health and care services, there are clear known and documented health inequalities that ethnic minority populations are experiencing, and so our anti-racism plans that each board will be delivering against is a combination of both, you know, the sort of the care that we deliver, but also the what we do to support our workforce, and that's really key because whilst we want overall everything that we do, we want people to be inclusive, we want people to understand, you know, kind of the unconscious bias and be inclusive, but sometimes you have to focus in on a particular area that you know is particularly misrepresented to start that sort of change and to start developing better sort of understanding, because we've moved. I think we still have a little bit of a sense that as long as we're following the law and we're doing X, Y, that should be okay. And actually where we've had to get with this is about explaining that actually it's not about intentional actions. It's about the fact that the evidence and the data and the experience is telling us that things need to change and we need to do things differently. So I think we will then move on to areas like disability, but we've already found that by focusing on a particular aspect of inclusion, people generally build the skills then to recognise what is inclusive behaviour, what are their biases, and how do they overcome them. So I think it has the desired effect.
So Fiona, I mean, we've gone through quite a bit there, and I just wondered what's next? What do the next 5 to 10 years look like in terms of from a chief people officer point of view? What would success look like over the next 5 to 10 years for the NHS Scotland?
Yeah, no, and it's a huge amount to do, and I think we're on the cusp of a sort of fundamental reform and transformation of our services that's required because because of the financial challenges, because of the population demands on our services, but actually also because we need to make sure that as well as just responding to the demand for services, that actually we play our part in terms of helping the population to live kind of healthier lives and focus on prevention. And so that fundamental shift in how the NHS is going to have to work, in how people access services, in how we deliver services, for the population of Scotland, which is only 5 million people, that will require us to make fundamental sort of change in our people functions. So actually, we need to become much more able and equipped to support radical transformation and change. We need to be in a space where we're really delivering added value, where sort of we're not just responding to the needs, but we also need to support our organisations and be able to deal with that fundamental level of change and transformation in roles and services, and I guess in working collaboratively across the NHS, but also working collaboratively in our health and social care partnerships locally, because actually that system level working is the only way that we're really going to sort of change the nature of the demand that we have. So I think there's real opportunities, and the people function it needs to be equipped and will be able to be equipped to support that in a very proactive way, rather than just sort of traditionally we've maybe been a little bit more of the responding to the needs and the asks of the organisation. So I think it's a really exciting time. It's going to be challenging, but I think it's a good thing for us as a profession and as an organisation, and ultimately it will benefit our population as well.
Well, listen, thank you very much for your time today, Fiona. It was excellent, great insight into what's going on at NHS Scotland and the challenges, but also the successes that you're having there in terms of the people function. So thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you very much. It's been great chatting.
Thanks for listening to the Recruitment and Beyond podcast. Hopefully there was plenty of insight for you to take back to your teams. So don't forget to subscribe and never miss an episode. And if you can, leave us a review. We really appreciate all the feedback and support we get. It makes a massive difference.